Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I'm so happy you joined us today. We're going to have a wonderful conversation with author Ona Gritz, who has written an absolutely fascinating memoir. There's so many levels and things that happen in it that you're just astounded and surprised by what comes next. So welcome, Ona.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and where this book came from?
Sure. So I am a writer. I've been a poet most of my writing life, and I am a sister who lost a sister tragically and violently in 1982 when I was 19 and my sister was 25. She and her husband and their 11-month-old son were all killed and murdered. And she was 30 weeks pregnant at the time. So 4 lives were lost. And I was not very, this sounds strange to say, but I was not very capable at grieving. For one thing, I was so used to being without my sister and missing her because she had been a runaway. With good reason. She wasn't treated well in our home. But as a result, when she died, I was able to kind of, put it away and say, well, she's gone again and go on with my life. Or so it seems. I mean, there's always this pallor. Even in my happiest times, there was always something, a sadness that lingered. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago, 30 years after the murders, that I finally allowed myself to want to know what happened to my sister. So the crime itself was solved very quickly. But what happened to her in her life? She was away from me for most of it. And some of the places that she went, she went voluntarily as a runaway as a young girl, and then my parents began to send her away, and I never knew anything about those places. Even the one place I did visit was a mystery. And I had kind of gotten stuck there in this mindset of a little girl of, that this was information that couldn't be mine, that I couldn't access, which finally occurred to me was ridiculous. I was actually a librarian. Research was something I knew how to do. So I began to explore my sister's life with a mission to bear witness to it. And also as a way to feel her loss, which is one of the things I discovered, is also a way to bring her close again, to have her in my heart and in my mind. And sometimes it felt working along with me as I uncovered her story and wrote it. And now the book is almost out. We're speaking on April 1st. It'll be out in just over 2 weeks. And people have started to read it. And it feels to me like every time someone reads it, she feels it somehow. And she's a little bit less gone. That's my hope.
That's really interesting. Your writing is so beautiful. At the beginning of the book, it seemed to me or felt to me like a child was writing it. That it was coming from a child's perspective. And that made it even more poignant because you were feeling for what a youngster would be experiencing at those different times in her early life. And the other thing I was thinking about, too, is knowing that you're a poet. Your writing's so beautiful. It's easy to understand. It's not like it's esoteric. Some people get it if they're like a poet or something, that it gets all over the place. But you don't do that. you just choose the best words for describing things so that it's very easy to see and understand what you're talking about.
That's really lovely to hear. Thank you, Emily. I strove for that. And I, probably spent way too much time polishing my sentences as I wrote. But it was something that it was kind of an anchor I could hold on to, is to, work on the writing as I'm uncovering some very painful things. I could take joy in the creation aspect of it.
Yeah, I can see that. I really can. From what I've read there, it's just beautifully written. I read so many books, and lots of them are absolutely fine, but they're not beautiful. And you would think a book that's about something as tragic as this is would be a hard read and uncomfortable and not pleasant to read. But it's powerful. It's very powerful, showing your love, what you went through, because you kind of portrayed her kind of as a victim of her circumstances. She had lots of different circumstances that affected her, but it was affecting you too. And you weren't putting yourself so much in those positions of poor me, or, I should have, would have, could have, those sorts of things. That wasn't there. It was just the compassionate look of a loving sister, a loving sibling.
Thank you. It took me a lot of drafts before I figured out how to bring myself into the story, or maybe, to be more honest, for me to want to look at who I was as her sister and really look at my relationship to my parents and how different it was from hers. And the thing that allowed me to get that close and begin to have empathy for both of us was when I switched over from writing about her to writing the story to her directly.
I love that. It was like, I would like to say love letter, but I don't want that to be misinterpreted. It's the sibling love that, you truly didn't get the opportunity to experience the sisterhood that you would have liked to have had. And that kind of yearning is obvious, but in a good way.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very true. I've always been very envious of sisters who get to have each other in a way that, we weren't even allowed for most of our youth, before she was really taken from me in the way that she finally was.
And I don't think I've interviewed somebody who's had a murder, let alone 4, and that they are experiencing, and it's powerful. I think we don't think about that, that could happen to me. You never know when some sort of big tragedy like that can happen to you.
Yeah, it's true, because we certainly didn't see it coming.
Oh, yeah.
She'd had a hard life, but it was actually starting to get better at the end of her life. Her marriage was a good one, and they were good for each other. They were building this family, and it just seemed like she had the future to look forward to.
Yeah, it felt that way. I loved your description of her baby. I could just see him. He seemed like a happy guy.
He was really a smiley, happy guy.
So it's nice that his life was happy. Hopefully he didn't really, you don't know what babies experience, what he would experience at the end. That if he has memories, hopefully they're all the good ones with those smiles and love.
I certainly hope so. And something that I can't know, and I can only hope, is that Angie didn't witness him being killed. I don't know the order that happened, but that's a hard place for me to put my attention.
Yeah, there's so much when something, even though it's essentially solved. The murders are solved. That doesn't mean that you know what happened.
Right. So it was a couple who killed them, and the man died in prison about 10 years ago, a little more. And the woman was released. They both been given multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. And then she was released unexpectedly to me. I wasn't notified. My brother-in-law's family wasn't notified. And it was just a done deal at that point. And that really opened the wound for us, for me and for Ray's brother, who I went through this with. And we asked her to write letters to us, just to, would she explain it? Would she do anything to help us understand why and what happened? And the letter we got back, no acknowledgement that she had anything to do with it. The evidence was, as you know from having read the book, the evidence was unmistakable. They were definitely guilty, and yet she wrote about it as though someone else had done it, and she was only sorry that she skipped town and didn't try to do more to help, which actually left me wondering whether she knows she did it or if somehow her mind allowed her to forget.
That could happen. It really could. I can't imagine living the rest of my life knowing that I had done something like that. It seems like it would be a logical thing to be able to block it out.
Yeah. And something else that I explore in the book is my own kind of amnesia, and I think that really stems partly from grief and probably some post-traumatic stress, but also from my own feelings of shame for having been the favored daughter, for having had a kind of protected life that my sister didn't have. And I know that my forgetfulness, my ability to kind of erase the worst of it comes from that. And so I can imagine, having been the perpetrator, that it could work similarly.
I hadn't really thought of that before, but it would make sense. And it would make sense to do exactly what you did. That if you can't know, and things would be so horrendous, you don't want to know about things.
Yeah. And my sister had a wonderful imagination. And my earliest memories are of the two of us playing pretend games. We would love to pretend we were go-go girls. It was the early 60s when I was very small. And so we would dance on our beds and listen to the radio and make up stories. And now I know that was her way of escaping her difficult childhood. And it became mine. I continued to sort of, now I would say, dissociate. At the time, it was just, I'm going to pretend I'm somewhere else. I'm someone else. In that sense, she taught me that skill of sort of leaving the difficult emotional material of our lives.
Wow. That's very interesting, looking at it like that. I can really see that. Mm-hmm. I know I was lonely in my childhood, and I escaped into music. I love to listen to different music and dance by myself to the music. And I even started playing flute and being in the band because music somehow was my safe place, my happy place.
Yeah, same. I would sit and listen to records, read the liner notes very carefully, and learn all the songs by heart.
I'm glad you mentioned the names of the songs, because I started humming along as I was reading your book. Lots of them had different memories for me, too.
Mm-hmm. Were you an only child?
Well, my sister was 9 years older. Mm-hmm. And so when I was in 5th grade, she got married and moved away. And so it was kind of an only child.
Yeah, similar to me, because Angie started leaving home when I was 6. And she would come back now and again, but never for long. And I think in some ways it's a unique kind of loneliness when you have that particular sibling that you miss, and you know what it's like to have that relationship.
Yeah, I can understand that. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
I always wanted, siblings, but at the same time, I was okay by myself because I didn't really want anybody else to be living the life that I was living. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
I was pretty much on my own. Yeah. One thing too that I was thinking is since you're a poet and you write poetry, which is something I envy. I write a lot, but I haven't really done much poetry, but I admire it a lot. I love to read it. And I would think that poetry would be a way that could help you work out things or deal with things by the way you can express them in poetry. Does that sound logical or?
It does. And yet I would say from my experience, I actually do better at working through things in prose. I think having that bigger room to work in, and also working in a genre that asks you to put more of yourself onto the page, gets me making discoveries more directly. With poetry, I tend to write with a little more restraint and want the images to speak for themselves, want to trust the reader to make the meaning. And that was actually something that I, turned out to be a deficit in earlier drafts of my book, was that I kind of left myself out because I was so used to just like letting the moment or the image speak for itself. And because memoir requires just, really thinking and feeling on the page. I found it to be, I think of it as an art form, but I also found it to be more personally therapeutic.
Yeah, I found writing to be very therapeutic for me with dealing with grief. That's why I help people write to deal with their grief now, because it helped me so much. Because I discovered, for me anyway, that there were stories I had to tell about things that happened. I just had to get them out.
Yeah.
And I didn't necessarily have to say something to somebody face to face, but I had to work my way through the different experiences and things that I was going through. It was for a long time, between two husbands being ill for a long time before they died. So there were lots of things. And I found that the more I wrote about it, the more I developed it, the more I really dove into it, the less I had to say about it the next time.
Oh, interesting.
So I would have like an example that I could use is when Jacques, my first husband who died, had emergency heart surgery when we didn't know he had a problem with his heart. And everybody in town, I think, knew him, and everybody wanted to know what happened and how did it happen. Well, I would tell him this story, a week-long story of things that happened throughout that week, that everything happened. And I'm sure they got bored to death, the first people I told that story to, because it was so long. But each time I told the story, because lots of people were asking me what happened, and it kept getting shorter and shorter till finally I said, well, he had heart surgery and he had 7 bypasses and now he's recovering. And that was the story. They didn't have to know all those little details as we went along, but it sure helped me to get all the details out to deal with it, because then I wasn't ruminating all the time on that sort of thing. I could pretty much let it go. I don't say I don't have the experience. I just don't have to focus on it.
Yeah. And it doesn't, when it's on the page, it's not in your body anymore in quite this. It's like a physical relief.
Yes, that's exactly it, that physical release, to let go of whatever it was. And it also brings me physical comfort with when I write to him now. I'll do that when there's something that I say, oh, I wish I could have told him that. Instead of that, I just write it in my journal. And that feels good. Mm-hmm. That helps me a lot. I think it's a good way for me to deal with things.
Yeah, and keeps you connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so excited that your book is coming out. I know people are it's hard to put down. It's very, very interesting reading because you just want to know what's going to happen next and how you're going to come through the whole thing. So it's a beautiful book. And when I first started reading it, as I mentioned, it was like it was a child writing it. And I thought, well, is the whole thing going to be like this? But I see how necessary that was to set the stage for everything that happened. So,
yeah, right. There were a lot of mysteries I uncovered as an adult that wouldn't be mysteries if you didn't live through some of the childhood, in a house full of secrets.
Yeah. Oh, House Full of Secrets. That sounds like a good book title. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you. This was a wonderful conversation, and I wish you well on the launch of your book. And I'm glad you wrote it just for you, if nothing else. It's a wonderful, wonderful book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate getting to talk to you about it and that you're reading it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And to my listeners, I'll have the information about our book so you can get your copy too in the show notes for this show. And I hope you'll pick it up. It's well worth the read. And I will see you again next week with another interesting guest. Aloha. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.